Now, somebody please, if you would, read Ezekiel 18, verses 4 and 20.
Behold, all souls are mine. The soul of the Father as well as the soul of the Son is mine. The soul who sins will die. The person who sins will die. The Son will not bear the punishment for the Father's iniquity, nor will the Father bear the punishment for the Son's iniquity. The righteousness of the righteous will be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked will be upon himself.
Very, very significant statement. We can recognize here in this passage that the people of Israel had a saying, and the saying was that the fathers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Now, the intention of that proverb, the intention of that saying was an accusation against God's justice, ultimately. They were saying, our fathers are doing things, and we are the ones who are being judged for it. Now, there is a difference between God punishing a child for what his father does and a child suffering negative consequences because of the choice his father makes, his or her father makes. You understand the difference? And children will suffer negative consequences if fathers do evil things. The consequences will be there, but that's different than blaming it on God and saying, God, why have you punished us for what our fathers did? And the essence of that proverb, it had gotten to the place where that was the mindset. The mindset was kind of an accusation against God. And so God addresses this issue through the prophet Ezekiel. And he says, no longer in the nation of Israel will this proverb be spoken. And he goes on to explain, the child will not be punished for the father's sin. The soul that sins will die. Very, very clearly addressing this issue. Now, the other dimension of this statement, is this whole passage, is this. And this is also important to see. That in this scenario, what Ezekiel does, he says, if you have an evil man, and then he has a son, that son has essentially two options. He can either follow his father's example and do what's evil, or he can learn from his father's example that that's not a good way to approach life. Look at the negative life my father has produced. I don't want that life, so I'm going to choose another option. And the passage clearly indicates that in both scenarios. You can have an evil man who has a son, and the son can either do evil or good. You can have a good man and have a son, and the son can either do evil or good. So even though the influence, whether it's good influence or bad influence, is in fact present, the child will not be judged by God for the father's conduct, and the child's future will not be dictated and determined by the father's conduct. You see, you understand. And I would encourage you to go back and read that passage in Ezekiel to see how that unfolds and that develops. So the first thing I want on the outline is this simple statement. That we need to recognize the possibility of avoiding environmental influences on the moral level. The possibility of avoiding environmental influences on the moral level does exist. Now, when we say on the moral level, we're saying that you can be raised or you can be exposed to a negative environment. Do you have to become a negative person? No. You do not have to allow that to shape your character and shape your choices. Now, for the most part, people will. Our job then would be to help people understand they don't have to. That they can stop that pattern, they can address that pattern, they can turn to God and look to God and find the power to reverse that pattern, that is a hope and a real possibility that exists for them. And once again, in maybe a more extreme environment like we have in the prison system, you will find people, that is a real hardcore struggle for people, number one, to comprehend, and then for number two, to stand up and seek God and address these patterns and habits that they have assumed, they have taken on to themselves, that they did not have to, but they have, in light of their environment. So environmental influences they don't cause our behavior. They don't cause our character. They can be avoided. They can be overcome. It's very important to understand. And one of the reasons is because in the midst of this crazy world, where all sorts of people are offering all sorts of information, most of the psychological community has come to the place where they give people a justification or an excuse for being who they are because of their environment or because of. And what we want to try to understand is that just like God is establishing in Ezekiel, in the final analysis, it is because that individual chose to cooperate with and agree with that influence. And if they get to the place where they recognize how destructive and detrimental cooperating with certain influences is, then they can turn that around. They can make a different choice. Okay? That's very important to keep alive, because we as the church, the pillar and support of the truth, are to offer people hope, are to offer people an answer. And part of that answer has to do with giving them that piece of the puzzle. If the church loses sight of that and does not have a good, solid biblical representation of what our relationship with sin is about, then I don't know where people are going to look for hope and deliverance. I think that's been put in our hands, and if we botch it up, it's a pretty hopeless case. So that's the first concept. Now, what we want to do then, just in light of those few statements and what we had talked about earlier in the whole class months ago about sin, we want to measure some prevailing concepts concerning sin against this above simple view of sin.